Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen. The topic I was asked to talk to was the relationship between trade performance and structural adjustment. And one simple way to think about that relationship is to start with these assumptions that if we were to get some poverty reduction, that would bring about better food security, and economic growth typically can reduce poverty, and trade can contribute to economic growth. So that's a very simple way of thinking about the way that expanding trade could be a good thing, other things equal. But of course other things aren't exactly equal, because trade necessarily involves production specialisation, and that tends to narrow the range of products that are available, that are being produced in a country. And so openness to trade almost always leads to uneven gains from being open to trade. And so it's possible that you could get a non-pro-poor outcome from being open, and therefore to ensure that that is a pro-poor outcome, there's a need for redistribution of some of the gains from trade, and that obviously puts pressure on governments to actually deliver, make a commitment to, and then have the capacity to efficiently redistribute in order to ensure gains are pro-poor. So let me just quickly talk to three points. Firstly, to look at how open African economies in fact are, and then to see a little bit about what openness has done to contribute to recent growth in Africa, and then thirdly look at what governments can do to maximise future contributions of trade to both poverty reduction and food security. So for a long time I think it's true that Africa has had higher costs of doing trade than other regions in the world, and that's both internally within each country as well as at the border, both land borders and even sea borders. Although the sea borders, if there's been good investments there because of mining exports or something, might have much lower trade costs than land borders with neighbours, even if the distances are greater to the coast. And secondly, in terms of governmental barriers to trade, most African countries have, over the last 5 decades or so since independence, discouraged agriculture relative to production of non-agricultural goods, and they've done so more than in other regions, and there's a database there you can go to look at if you're interested in this issue. This graph just simply summarises data from that database for 3 continents, Africa plus Latin America and Asia. And what it's suggesting, what that set of numbers is suggesting, is that for Africa, for example, in the 60s and 70s, agricultural prices were about 20% below what they were in international markets relative to the prices of other tradables. And that degree of discrimination against agriculture has gradually diminished. So that heavy black line has gone towards zero, but the slope of that line is less than Latin America's and certainly less than Asia's. So what that's suggesting is that Latin America and Asia were more negative towards agriculture in the past, but they've got rid of their negative policies over these past couple of decades and have reformed more, in fact, than has Africa. Here's some data just for a few West African countries from the same database. It's just looking at the nominal rate of assistance to agriculture, which is negative in each of those countries except Nigeria, but all of them except Cote d'Ivoire seem to have moved towards zero, thereby getting rid of some of that negative assistance to farmers. So the next question is, has that move towards a more open set of economies in the continent contributed to economic growth? So this recent World Bank study looked at this econometrically and using the same database of relative rates of assistance as the indicator of distortions to prices in these economies, and it showed that there has indeed been a positive contribution to the gradual removal of that discrimination against agriculture, to overall economic growth, not just agricultural growth, but overall economic growth in Africa. What have we seen of this recent growth experience? Well, certainly it's been accompanied by, the overall economic growth has been accompanied by trade growth, and in the past decade, Africa has increased its share of world trade by about 1/3. But when you decompose that growth in trade, about half of it is due to just one product, petroleum, whose price has risen a lot, and there's been a supply response to that with the exploration and opening up of new petroleum sites. Minerals have accounted for another 20%, and so agriculture, in fact, has only contributed about 1/11 of that trade growth. And I think there's probably three reasons for that. One is that agricultural prices internationally rose less than petroleum prices and other mineral prices. Secondly, the supply response in agriculture has probably been less than the supply response in the minerals and energy sectors. And thirdly, Sub-Saharan Africa's comparative advantage is not very strongly in agriculture overall. It's much stronger in other primary sectors, mining, fishing, maybe forestry in some areas. So that's the graph of prices over the past 5 decades for food and for energy raw materials. And you can see in this past decade that the growth in the price of petroleum is about twice as high as the growth in the price of food in those international markets. So that's certainly encouraged the exploration and exploitation of energy raw material sites. If you look at this set of countries for the region, you can see that if you want to find an index of trade specialisation, a sort of indicator of comparative advantage, you can look at, for each sector, net exports as a fraction of exports plus imports. So that ratio is going to range between -1 and +1, and 0 means that you're self-sufficient in that sector. So the blue lines are the agricultural sector with the food part thrown in. The red ones are all primary products. And it's clear that in a lot of these countries, like Nigeria, it's obvious that it has this strong minerals comparative advantage, but a strongly negative agricultural comparative advantage. Senegal has got negative for both because of other exports like tourism and so on that are dominant. But for Africa as a whole, it's similar to the rest of West Africa, which is close to self-sufficiency in food, so not a major exporter or a major importer, but very strongly, a very strong comparative advantage in other primary products. And so that's where its comparative advantage is dominant. And that, when you look at what might happen to the world economy over the next 2 decades, as we did recently for the Asian Development Bank, because they were interested in finding out how much their region would change in the course of global economic growth. The African share of agricultural output in that projection to 2030 certainly grows, but it grows far less than the share of other primary production in the world. And so agricultural self-sufficiency doesn't change very much from that roughly 100% for the region, but the dominance of other primary products does. So you can see there the share of other primary products in global GDP for Africa goes from about 6 to 11%, whereas agriculture's share stays around the 5% mark. But global GDP, you can see, is growing because Africa is assumed to grow more rapidly than the world economy as a whole, and as Simon suggested earlier today, certainly much faster than the developed countries. So if sub-Saharan African economic growth is going to be concentrated more in the energy, raw material and mineral rich countries, if you're thinking about the region as a whole, then it's less likely that that growth is going to be pro-poor if we look at the experience of recent times for sub-Saharan Africa. And if you use that data econometrically, you find that the elasticity of the poverty headcount reduction to income growth is about 1/3 larger in resource-rich, third smaller in resource-rich versus other sub-Saharan African countries. So the resource-rich countries of Africa are certainly have less of a poverty head count, but that head count has come down less in recent times as a consequence of their growth, even though those countries have grown faster than the non-resource-rich parts of sub-Saharan Africa. That's looking at it from a country point of view. If we look at it from a sector point of view for any one country, again, it's, if energy or minerals are going to be the source of growth, you're going to have a booming sector problem, a Dutch disease problem, and it's likely that the growth that would come from that will be, is less likely to be pro-poor. And I refer you there to a book that IFPRI published last year that does a lot of analysis of this, and you can have a look at those in detail for particular countries. And this is going to be especially the case if there's very little redistribution of the resource rents from that minerals boom to poor households. And that typically is the problem, that governments like to siphon off some of that money for themselves or don't redistribute it to poor rural areas, which is where most of the poverty remains. So the bottom line then is to ensure that sub-Saharan African growth is indeed pro-poor into the future. It's necessary that governments have both a commitment and develop a capacity to efficiently redistribute some of those gains from openness to trade. And again, a lot of IFPRI research has been focused on asking questions about how you could ensure that sort of outcome, and the evidence from that research is that you do not get that outcome from lots of subsidies to agriculture. That's just moving along a supply curve. Much better is to invest some of those resource rents in shifting down that supply curve for agriculture, making it more productive, and agricultural research and development investments and rural infrastructure investments are especially likely to be pro-poor for rural households, and especially if that is focused on food staples, it will be more likely to be pro-poor. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.